take 1 second just to say welcome to the people that join us online. A lot of people are traveling and different things like that, and we want to say, hey, we're glad to have you as part of our service. We don't have a live stream yet, but we do post this later, and a lot of people are watching this, and I want to say so glad to have you watching us, and we appreciate that. If you want to interact with us, go to our website, newbranch.net, and we'd love to interact with you. There's plenty of ways to contact us, so don't be a stranger. Please interact with us, and we're so glad you're watching, okay? So here's what we're doing today. Today we are continuing a series called Back to School. Today we're continuing a series called Back to School, where we're looking at the life of Moses, and we're taking some lessons from his life that God, I believe, wants to take us, just like our kids are going back to school. He's taking us back to give us some life lessons from one of the most famous people in all the Bible, if not, and honestly, all the world. And so we're going to take a look at his life. Before we do, though, here's how I want to kind of start today. I think this story kind of illustrates exactly what we're talking about, and I think it'll help us. How many people have ever seen The Karate Kid, the movie? Okay, the old one, not the new one, right? Okay. How many people saw The Karate Kid in the theater? Anybody? Does anybody know how old The Karate Kid movie is? It's 35 years old. Somebody's going, man, I wish you hadn't said that, right? 1984, if I'm doing the math right, that's 35 years. Anybody know how old Daniel Russo or Ralph Macchio is now? He was a little bit older when he played the part. Not much, but he was older than what he was in the movie. He's 57. Okay, you're welcome. I just want to make sure you felt old today because we're going old school with Moses. No, I'm just playing. No, what we really were trying to do today with that is this. There's a scene in The Karate Kid. Hopefully it makes sense to you. If not, go rent the movie and you can see it for yourself or whatever. You can't rent movies anymore, so live stream it or stream it from Amazon or whatever. And so in the movie, there's a scene where he gets bullied by some people. This is kind of the premise. And then he gets set up to go, hey, he ends up being in a karate competition where he's got to fight this guy that's been bullying him, okay? But in this teenager's apartment building, there is an old Japanese guy who looks like he probably would know karate because he's Japanese and Asian, so he must know karate. And his name is Mr. Miyagi. And so he comes and he says, I'll train you to get ready, and I'm going to help you with learning how to do karate. And so he comes over to his house and he says, hey, I don't want you, he goes, okay, so what am I doing to train? We're going to start punching. No, here's what I want you to do. I want you to wax my cars. And he's like, really? And but I want you to do it a certain way, wax on, wax off, wax on, wax off. And he keeps telling that, and breathe in, breathe out. And then for about 3 days, he just gives him chores to do around his house. And finally, the kid, right, the teenager, he gets so mad, right? He's like, look, I've been waiting for you to train me, and all you have me doing is your chores. This doesn't make sense. And then he curses him out. That's one reason why we can't show the clip in church, but a lot of people feel like that way about their life, believe me. And it's like, it just doesn't make sense. And then all of a sudden he says, show me wax on, wax off. And he's like, I'm not doing that. And then he says it in kind of a samurai way, and he's like, okay, I will do it. And when he shows him wax off, wax on, wax off, he moves his hand, and when he does, he throws a punch and he blocks it. And for the first time he realized, oh, it makes sense. I've been going through a process that I didn't even realize. And what I want to tell you today is this, is that I believe the same thing is happening to some of us here today, that you've been going through a process that you didn't even realize, that God is about to enlighten you, and he's going to take you, I really believe in your faith, to a whole nother level if you'll let him. Very important principles. So here's what we're going to do today. We're just going to cover one verse of Scripture, okay? Just one verse. Now, I can do a lot with one verse, believe me, okay? So don't get excited like we're getting out early or something like that. But I want you to really focus in on this one verse. And then I'm going to give you some other places to look up and different things like that to do with it. Okay? So I've got to kind of explain where we're at here. This is Exodus chapter 4. Exodus 4 and verse 2. That's what we're going to look at. Something that God said to Moses. But before that, you kind of have to understand where Moses was coming from. Moses was an 80-year-old shepherd. He was living in the middle of nowhere in a little small town on the backside of a desert called, anybody? Midian. He's not in Isle of Wight County. You thought I was going to say Zune. I didn't, but I'm not saying it today. That wasn't even a funny joke, right? He lives in Midian, okay? And how he got there was he was raised in Pharaoh's own household. That he came at a time where the Israelites had been slaves for 400 years. And they were in Egypt, and his mother hid him, and the daughter of Pharaoh found him, and she raised him as her own daughter, and he had leadership. And I believe because he was instilled that, hey, you're not an Egyptian, you are a Hebrew, I think he thought to himself, hey, I have all the things that no other Hebrew has ever had, and I'm in Pharaoh's own household. I am probably delivered. And at age 40, he hit an Egyptian because he was really beating up this old guy, and he hit him and accidentally killed him. And I think he thought, they'll rise up with me, and they didn't. And they turned on him, and Pharaoh said he's going to kill him. And so he fled, and he ran as far as he could go on the backside of a desert to a little town in the middle of nowhere called Midian. And you know what they were known for in Midian? Being shepherds. Do you know why that's the best witness protection program that he could have had? Because the Egyptians hate shepherds. They don't like shepherds. They think they're the lowest job you can think of is a shepherd to the Egyptians. In fact, when Joseph was there hundreds of years before, they said, hey, my family's going to come here to escape the famine. That's how they ended up in Egypt. And what did they say? They said, that's great. We want to honor your family, but they cannot live in Egypt because they will offend us because they're shepherds. So what does Moses do? He becomes a shepherd. And for 40 years, he watches over sheep, and then the burning bush. We talked about a whole process last week, so if you missed that, newbranch.net is our website. Go back and listen, because we had an extreme process that God has taken him through, and I don't want to take anything away from that. But he humbled Moses to the place where he had to learn that he had to depend on God. And I believe that Moses really didn't understand it. And today is kind of that moment, that wax on, wax off type moment, where it's like, it's about to make sense what God's doing. I have a feeling it's going to do the same thing for you. That's why God's sharing it. And Moses, God comes through the burning bush, right? He sees a bush that's on fire, and all of a sudden it's the voice of God, and he's thinking, hey, am I having a senior moment, right? I mean, that's probably what he's thinking, right? It's like, what's happening here? I mean, there's a bush that don't burn up, and now I'm hearing the voice, and he says it's God. I mean, like, am I losing it? Did I have a stroke, or didn't know it, or what? And then all of a sudden it's like, no, it really is God. And then God says, hey, here's what I need you to do. I want you to go to Egypt, and I want you to deliver my people, and I want you to go tell Pharaoh, let my people go. And he's like, now? I'm an old man. I kind of look like Santa Claus out in the desert. I look like a desert Santa Claus. I'm not going. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, it just doesn't even make sense. And he doesn't say that to God. At first, he's just kind of stunned. And God wasn't saying, hey, when I want you, and once he realized what God was really saying, he was saying, I want you to go now. You see what I'm saying? Like, God didn't say, hey, I need you to plan this, Moses, and in about 6 months from now or a year from now, you're going to go and deliver the people. No, I need you to, like, right, whatever you're doing, you're watching sheep, get somebody to watch the sheep because you're going to Egypt to now tell them, let my people go. It's like, what kind of plan is that, right? He's like, I don't know if I should do that, right? And then in what we see in Exodus 4 that leads up to what God's about to say to us today, Exodus 4, verse 1, you know what he says? He says, well, what if they don't believe me, right? I got a lot of questions for you, God. I mean, like, what if I go there, why would they believe me, right? And not only that, but how would they believe? What if they say you didn't send me? I mean, I'm seeing a burning bush. They don't see it, so what's up? You know, like, how's that going to work? And here's what God says to him, and I want you to hear it, because I think this is a word for us today. Then the Lord said to him, what is in your hand? What's in your hand? You know what I think Moses was doing? I think he thought, nothing, right? And then he looked over at his hand, and here's what he said. A staff. Now, you'd have to be in his culture to understand it's a staff. You know, like the kind of thing that you watch sheep with. For me, you see, God, when I was 40, you know, when I came to Midian, you know what was in my hand? A scepter. I was a ruler. Right? I mean, I was part of Pharaoh's household. It's known through history. He was a general. Not only did I have a scepter to rule with, I had a sword. I was a general. I was a person I was a mighty warrior. Now I'm 80 years old, and I'm the most detestable people in this empire. I'm a shepherd. That's what I have in my hand. And he didn't get it. And I have a feeling it's the same for you. Let me ask you a question today. What's in your hand? That's what God's asking you. There's two things you have to get if you want God's power in your life and you want him to empower you to accomplish an amazing thing with your life. There's two things you got to get, and I'm going to share those with you today. Two things. We'll put them up here, and you can write them down. Two things. The first one is this. Realize Jesus is what I really need. I want to put that in first person. Realize Jesus is what I really need. It's God's power. See, Moses got it, and he didn't even know he had gotten it because he had been through a process and he had learned some things that he didn't know, and God's about to use that in an amazing way. Realize that the power you need is God. Now, that's awesome. That's perfect. Go back and listen to last week's message if you need more on that. I don't want to move past it because you cannot do what we're talking about today without God's power. But let me tell you what God's going to use. Let me tell you how God accomplishes what he's going to do. What's in your hand? That doesn't make sense, doesn't it? You know why? Because what's in your hand isn't enough, is it? That's why the thing actually says, it doesn't say, here's what it takes to be an incredible leader. It says, what do you do when you don't have enough? Right? I don't even know if that's grammatically correct. But then God kind of said, what's that in your hand? Okay, I don't know about that, but if God can say it, I guess we can. Okay. So what am I saying? Realize that Jesus is what I really need. Now, that's important, but there's one more part to it. And if you don't get this, you're never going to have it. See, the pendulum for the church goes like this. I'm not humble. I can do it. I can pull myself up by my own bootstraps. And then one day we realize I need God's power in my life to do anything. So I can do nothing without God's power. That's 100% correct. But here's the problem with that. Then we get to the place where we go, well, then God's going to do all the work. Is that what you think? You think that's how God's going to bless your life? That he's going to do everything and you're going to do nothing? And that's why you're not blessed. Because some of us have this mentality that, well, I can't do anything because you know what I have in my hand? I don't have anything. Is that right? And then we probably do like Moses. Well, okay, I don't have anything. Oh, yeah, I have a shepherd's staff. What can God do with a shepherd's staff? Let me show you, okay? I'm just going to take you through it. You can read it for yourself. With the shepherd's staff after that day, you know what he immediately told him? He said, all right, you don't believe me? What's in your hand? Okay, take what's in your hand, throw it on the ground. And you know what it turned into? It turned into a snake, which I was like, of all the things, I can't stand snakes, but okay. But not just a snake. The word in the Hebrew is not just snake. The word actually means sea serpent, and it has connotations of the same sea serpent that it talks about in the book of Job. That is one of the most deadly snakes that's ever existed. It's believed to be a historic snake that maybe doesn't exist now, almost mythological, but when he threw it down, that's what it was. So he's like, wow, that's pretty impressive, right? Now pick it up, and it comes your staff again. You have all you need, because what you really need is Jesus. Now, if you're looking at it, you're going, this is Old Testament. Jesus wasn't even born yet, but realize that Jesus is part of the eternal Godhead, that God is one God in three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Jesus is God. That at the burning bush, it's the voice of Jesus. Please don't miss that, right? So don't think that he wasn't. Moses just didn't know who Jesus was yet. He was the promised Messiah, and he was to come. So in our case, since Jesus came, realize Jesus is what you really need. He's the power, right? You can't make your staff turn into a snake, can you? But realize that God is going to use what you have. And Moses comes, right, and he finally goes, and he goes, okay, I'm going to go, and he goes very reluctant. In fact, he's so reluctant that he won't even speak the words, that all the words that we talk about today that Moses says, he doesn't say with his own lips, actually his brother Aaron says them, okay? That kind of takes a little bit of the climactic part out. So he gets to Egypt, and he says, let my people go, but it's not him. He whispers in Aaron's head, tell him, let my people go. And Aaron says, let my people go. That's how it works. That's how scared he is. And he goes there, and they tell Pharaoh, and you know what Pharaoh says? He gets there, and he says, God, thus saith the Lord, let my people go. That's a big moment, right? You know what Pharaoh says? He says, no. Right? Thanks for asking, right? I'm not mad at you. Good question, right? Love your people, love what you have to say. No. That's basically what he said. And then Moses says, well, let me show you something. He throws down his snake, throws down his rod, turns into a snake. And Pharaoh's like, that's impressive. Let me show you what my magicians can do. They do the exact same thing. Whether it be demons that allowed them to do that power or just a magic trick, they have both had their snakes out. And guess what? His sea serpent, it ate all the other snakes. Don't think God's afraid of the resistance. You know what I'm trying to tell you? Expect that when God calls you to it, there's going to be resistance, and God has a plan for that, or your world's going to be rocked, because Pharaoh's going to say no. And a lot of Christians go, you know what? I tried to follow God one time, and then Pharaoh said no. What did you think he was going to say? They've been slaves for 400 years. He's like, I'm not letting them go. It's how we built the pyramids, on the backs of our slaves. 2 million people? I don't think so, right? You better do better than your snake, Moses. And he's like, watch what God can do. And he performed the greatest miracles that the world has ever seen. But do you know what was in his hand the entire time he performed every miracle? The staff, right? It's true. You'll see it in every picture that we see nearly, I don't know how many thousands of years later, but it's at least 4,000 years since the time of Moses, right? You know, every picture that's drawn with Moses, you know what he has in his hand? You believe God can do something with what you have? And believe me, it's his power that does it, but that's what he uses. I'm not talking about one time, I'm talking about every time. What happens next? He goes from there, and then he finally performs all these miracles, and the last one is so awesome that they tell them to leave Egypt, that after all the firstborn children died, Pharaoh finally says, I've had enough, and my people detest you, and they pay them to leave, fulfilling the prophecy in Genesis 15 that said, you will be strangers in a land that you won't know. You'll be taken and oppressed, and you'll be slaves, and I will release you. And not only that, but they'll pay you to leave, and that will fund all the vision that God has. Isn't that amazing? This whole time they're slaves. It gets worse before it gets better, and then God has them give enough money that when they get there, they have enough money to build the temple if they want to. That's God's plan, right? Now, if he had told all that up front, maybe, right? But he doesn't do that. He's saying, what do you have in your hand? That's what I'm going to use, if you'll trust me. They get there, and after they leave, how does it feel to finally walk in freedom? If you ever been in jail and got out, then you would know, right? I visit a lot of people in jail, and even when I leave, I'm like, man, this feels good to get out. Maybe you've experienced where you've been in debt, and you're like, what does it feel like when you finally pay everything off? Some of you guys, you don't know that could even happen. And it's like when you get out of the bondage, it just feels like you walk with a freedom that you just can't believe. And they're leaving after 400 years. None of these people have ever been free. They're all slaves. And they're walking in the freedom, and they just can't believe that it's really happening, and they are fully funded. And as they walk, they get to a place, and they're walking along, and all of a sudden they realize behind them the Egyptians decided to change their mind. But this time they're not coming to take them back as slaves, they're coming to kill them. Because they're going, no people in the world should ever know that the Egyptians let you guys do this to us, and we're going to kill every last one of you. And they're coming down on them. And unfortunately, they're in literally a rock and a hard place where the Red Sea is on one side of them, and there's rocks all around them, and the Egyptians have spanned out like this, and they're coming in on them, and they go crazy. You ever been there? Where all of a sudden it's a big moment, and you're like, I don't know how to get out of this. And you know what God says? You know what Moses does? He's the only one that does. He falls on his knees. Remember we talked about a process last week? Not fall on your face, but fall on your knees. And he humbles himself before God. He says, I have no idea, but I'm trusting that God will get us out of this. And you know what God tells Moses? Stretch out your hand. You hearing me? I mean, you read the words. It's in the book of Exodus. This is exactly what he says. It didn't say stretch out your staff, but let me ask you a question. What's in your hand, Moses? What have you been carrying the whole time? Stretch out your hand, and what's in your hand is the staff of God, and what they see is Moses does this, and the Red Sea does this, right? Because God can use what you have. Now, please don't misunderstand me. You can't part the Red Sea with a staff, can you? No, that's the power of God, but what does God use? They get to the other side. The Egyptians chase after them, and God causes it to close, and now they're really free, right? And then they go down the road a little further, and then they run into another problem. And you know what the problem is? They have no water. Anybody that's a survivalist in the desert understands this. You will not live long without water. Within 3 days or less, probably less when you're in the heat, you will lose the ability to rationally think. I think they lost the ability to rationally think, because here's what they said. You brought us out here to die? Right? I mean, God has done this miracle and all these miracles, and instead of believing God, you know what they do? They go, you brought us out here to die. We're going to kill you and go back to Egypt. And you know what Moses does? He falls on his knees before God. And you know what God says? Take your staff and hit the rock. And Moses does, and you know what comes out? Water. But you know what God used? What was in his hand? You hearing me? Or am I just making this up? I mean, I'm telling you, this is the story of Moses. Read it in Exodus. This is what happens. And after they leave there, what happens next? They go, and every place they go, he has the staff in his hand. By the way, when they get to the promised land, this journey doesn't go like he thinks. And I have a feeling this is where some people are in life. Their journey does not go at all like he plans. They get to the promised land finally after the 10 Commandments and all the stuff, and it's an amazing journey, and they finally get there and they get ready to go in, and we're believing God to do great things, and they send spies in to figure out what's going on because there's occupants there. And they come back and they're afraid, and you know what they say? They all get so upset that they want to kill Moses and the 2 spies that say they can take the land. And God says, because of your lack of faith, after all I've done, none of you are going into the promised land. Huh? No, here's what you're going to do. You're going to march around the wilderness for 40 years while this generation dies, and then your children will go into the promised land. Kids that were not born in Egypt will go into the promised land. Your kids will, and I will fulfill what I said I would do through Moses. Now, wait a minute, Moses. You understand why what you have in your hand is super important? Because for 40 years, you know what you're going to be? You're going to be a shepherd. You just didn't think that, right? You're like, why did it take 40 years to prepare me? Because I need somebody that can take these people around the wilderness, and I will supernaturally preserve this people, and then I will take them into the promised land, but not them, their generation. And then as he goes, you know what happens after 40 years of working with people? When you go from being 80 to 120? Let me ask you a question. You ever led people? And then you have people complain, right? It's too hot. It's too cold. And you're in the same room, right? I mean, right? I mean, like, you know what it does to people when people grumble? In fact, God even said it. He said it for him. He's like, it exhausts you, right? And they finally come back to another place, and guess what happens? They don't have water again. And the people just get on his nerves to the very last end. And he's so mad, and God says, here's what I want you to do. Go speak to the rock, and I'll give him water. And you know what Moses does? He takes his staff, and he smacks the rock like before. And I think he does it because he's so angry. And he takes the staff, and he smacks the rock, and water comes out of the rock. It's true. And then God comes alongside him, and he says, because you did that, you're not going into the promised land. What? You know, it took me years. I was like, what a mean God, right? I mean, come on. I'm a big picture person. I'm like, just because of one small technicality, I mean, like, what is that, right? I mean, like, that's crazy, right? Unless you understand what it means. You know why it was so big a deal to God? It was the staff. The power, it represented the power of God, and you took it for granted, Moses. You didn't think for a second. You used it for your own purposes. You didn't think it was important. And see, let me tell you, that is a lesson for somebody here today. You have something in your hand and you're disrespecting it. And it's the reason why God is not blessing your life. Because he gave you what you had. And what you're saying is, I don't have nothing, right? And that's why you're not being used, because God will use what you have. Now, please don't get too upset with God over Moses, because Moses lived an incredible life. And God forgave Moses, and Moses repented and was never angry with God. And when he got there, God said, I'm going to give you the most spectacular death that's ever been. And he takes Moses up and he says, these people are going to go into the promised land. And the person you mentor, Joshua, is going to take them. And I will show you not only what happens here, but I will allow you to see the future generations from this mountain. It was absolutely incredible what God did for Moses, and he was completely restored. And he died on that mountain, and God took him, and God himself buried him. Please don't think that was a bad legacy. It was awesome. And next week we're going to tell you a little bit more. We got one more for the life of Moses. But what I'm trying to tell you today is this, is that God used what was in his hand. Let me ask you a question today. What's in your hand? Because God can do a lot with a little, right? We'll give you a couple other places just so you don't think that Moses was the only, that this is just one verse. This is the principle if you want to be used by God. Write down 1 Samuel chapter 17. You're going to be able to go back to that. A young teenage boy came to the battlefield, and he found that there was a giant Philistine that was yelling out curses at God and to his people. And nobody would fight him because they were scared. And he said, hey, if you'll fight me, then just the two of us can fight, and whoever wins, then the other side will be our slaves. And the teenage boy was named David, and the giant was named Goliath. And I think most people, I usually try to explain the Bible, but most people have heard this one, right? David and Goliath. If you haven't, then what happens? They say, hey, you need a sword? And he says, no, because God's going to use. You know what he uses? what's in my hand. A sling. I'm sorry, that's what a shepherd boy uses to kill small animals. Not a giant warrior that has been trained from the time he was small and empowered by demons. That's what it's believed, because he was a Nephilim. You can look that up for yourself. There's all kinds of weird stuff with Nephilim. If you like weird stuff, look that up. Goliath was a Nephilim. He was empowered by Satan. But God's more powerful, right? What's in your hand? I don't need armor. You know what I need? I need what God gave me. And he killed the giant. And you know what? It says, I love the graphic part, sorry. Lord of the Ring type stuff. You know what he says? He went and he cut off Goliath's head, but not with his own sword because he didn't have one. He had to take Goliath's because he didn't have anything. The only thing he had was a sling and the power of God. God used what he had. You starting to get me today? I'll give you another one. 1 Kings chapter 17. The greatest prophet in the Bible, his name was Elijah. And he did so many incredible things. But when he first started, here's what he did. The children of Israel had sinned against God. And he said, hey, he was supposed to come and tell them, hey, he's not going to send rain for 3 years. You know what happens when you don't get rain for 3 years? You are going to starve. People are not happy with that message. And Elijah went into a season of hiding while there was nothing there. And then he didn't have any food, and God miraculously fed him. And then he said, hey, for your next meal, here's what I want you to do. It's been a while since I've given anything. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to go to this lady's house, and I want you to ask her to give you a meal. And he's like, oh, okay, this lady must have a lot, right? And he gets there, and the lady's like, hey, what? He said, God sent me here to get a meal from you. And she said, I don't have enough. I'm not kidding. She said, I have enough to make one last pancake, 2 pancakes, one for me and one for my son, and then we're just going to die. I believe it wasn't pancakes. I think it was donuts, but that's just me, right? It's like, hot now, 2 donuts, okay? I mean, that's what I see. And she's like, we get 2 donuts, and then we're done. And he said, here's what I want you to do. You know, he didn't back off. This is important. Because faith sometimes is saying, oh, you don't have much, so you must not be able to do anything. I am so sorry I asked you. Is that what you thought? And the great prophet said, wait a minute, God told me to do this, so here's what I'm asking you to do. Would you have enough faith in God and me that you would split that in 3 parts? And she's like, that's a big ask, right? The last meal for my kid. Okay. And she does it. And you know what happens the next day? They go back, and there's just enough to make 3 more donuts. And 3 more donuts. And every day, they had a donut for 3 years. Now, it wasn't a lot, but it was enough, wasn't it? You know what God used? What she had. You hearing me? I'll give you another one just to make sure we get it. 2 Kings chapter 4, another prophet that came after Elijah, his name was Elisha. If I ever get a chance with these names, I'm like, go by a different name. I mean, it's so confusing. Elijah, Elisha. Okay, Elisha comes after Elijah. He's the next prophet, okay? And he was mentored by Elijah. Elisha was mentored by Elijah. Okay, tongue twisters. Elisha comes, and a lady comes to Elisha, and she says, my husband has served God his entire life, and now he's been killed. It's believed that her husband was the prophet Obadiah. Might not know much about him. There's a whole book called Obadiah, if you didn't know. That's who he is. And Obadiah is dead. And not only is it hard that I lost him, but he served God his whole life, and I served God my whole life, and we have given for the cause. But let me tell you what's happened here. I have no money, and Elijah, and they're coming, the collectors are coming, and they're not just doing it to me, but they're going to take my boys and make them slaves because I don't have any money. What do you say to that, man of God? And you know what he says to her? What do you have? I'm serious. If you want to help impoverished people, the biggest thing about poverty, and I know because I've been there, is the impoverished mindset. And what we tell people is let me do it all for you, and we demoralize them. And God is not an enabler. What he does is he does something else. He is actually giving them dignity. And he comes to that lady, and the prophet doesn't say, oh, let me give you everything I have. Because you know why the prophet didn't say that? Because the prophet didn't have anything. He had no money. But you know what he gave her? He said, let me ask you a question. What do you have? Because he understood a principle. And she said, I don't have nothing. Okay? That's how she said it, I believe. Okay? I don't know if she said that. But that's how people talk when they're down, right? All the grammar goes out the door, right? It's like, I don't have nothing. Oh, I have 1 bottle of olive oil. Oh, you do, huh? Go out and get as many jars as you can. That's what he says. You read it for yourself. And she brings out as many jars as she can get, and then she starts to pour the oil, and the oil doesn't run out until every jar is full. If she had more jars, she would have got more. You understand what I'm saying here? And they went out and they sold the oil, and you know what it paid? It paid off all of her debt, and it set her up for the rest of her life. You know what God used? What was in her hand. Are you hearing me? What you have is not enough. But it's enough when you take what's in your hand and you give it to God, then it's enough. But here's what you got to understand. God put it in your hand. Stop disrespecting it. Stop thinking it's nothing. Stop saying you have nothing. You don't have enough, but give God what you have and it will be enough. Are you starting to get where he's going here today? I just gave you several examples. I could go on and give you 100 more, but I'm just going to give you one more, okay? It's Labor Day weekend, so y'all got to listen a little faster, okay? Matthew 14, one of my favorite stories in all the Bible, is where Jesus walks on the water. But that's not the story I want to tell you today. It's what happens before. I want to tell you what happens at the very beginning of Matthew 14. Jesus had just experienced an incredible loss. His cousin and one of his best friends, John the Baptist, was beheaded. And he was feeling sorrow. Now, he's God, he knows everything, but it hurt him that he lost. Emotionally, he felt down. But you know what Jesus did when he felt down? He got in a boat and he went to a small little town in the middle of nowhere in Isle of Wight County. No, I'm just playing. That's what it sounds like. That's what it reads like. He went out in the middle of the country, in the middle of nowhere, and you know what he started doing? He started healing people. He started serving people. He started encouraging people. That's a whole message for another day, but when you're down, you know what you need to do? You need to start helping other people, and it's going to bring you up. That's what I'm telling you. That's what Jesus did. And when he did, his spirit started to lift, and it went on all day, it says, right? And I think that the disciples were probably Baptists because they were kind of like, Jesus, you're preaching a long time, so their people are getting hungry. And you know, the Holy Spirit can't work when people are hungry. You see, the reason why I say they're Baptists is if they were Pentecostal, they would have brought food with them, okay? Because they know it's going all day. Okay, sorry. I've been to both, so I get it. All right, sorry. This is funny. But they said, Jesus, it's getting late, and there's nowhere to eat. We're out in Zuni, and there ain't no place to eat out here. They don't have restaurants out here. So we need to send them away. And you know what Jesus says to them? What do you have? You read it, Matthew 14, that's verbatim. What do you have? And you know what they say? We don't have anything, right? And he asks them again, what do you have? Well, okay, we got a boy here that his mom packed him a lunch, and he's got 2 pieces of bread and like 5 sardines. Literally, that's what they got. So would you like us to be bullies, Jesus, and steal his lunch today, or what are you saying? And he's like, bring me what you have, right? And they're like, what? And then he says, now let's pray. Let's thank God for what we're about to receive. And they're thinking, this is ridiculous, right? And you know what he does? He breaks the food, he thanks God, and he acts like it's going to be a meal, and he has everybody sit down, and all of a sudden, that small meal feeds, at the end, over 5,000 people. Can I say it again? What do you have in your hand? Because that's what God is going to use. And some of us, we don't believe it, and that's why you are stuck. That's why God is not using your life, because you don't think he can use what you have. And believe me, I could go on, if you let me, all day and go through the rest of Scripture, and it's the only way God works. He always uses what you have. And what you have is never enough, but he makes it enough if you'll believe him. I'll make it personal just for a minute. I always try to be careful with that, but I think it's important today. Hard to believe, 23 years ago, maybe even longer, I hate to say it that way, I went to a church called Western Branch Community Church. I'd been out of church for a season, and I went back, and while I was there, over the first year I was there, I really felt the call to be a pastor on my life. And I went to the pastor there, and he affirmed that gifting in me, and he met with me for 3 years. And we decided that, hey, I'm going to plant a church, and we started to come up with a plan for it. And several years after that, my life kind of fell apart where I didn't get to plant a church. And my wife had some physical problems and some problems with post-traumatic stress and some different things. And we financially collapsed, and we had to actually sell everything we had, and we moved in with my in-laws. It was a very down time in my life. And I just remember being so frustrated that you called me, but I don't get to do what you called me to do. And I kept going to my job. It was a mundane job. It was a good job, and it worked out, but I'm appreciative of it now. I wasn't then, because I was like, it's not what I'm called to do. And I would go day after day, week after week, year after year, and so frustrated. I remember one day I just turned on the radio, and I heard a pastor, and I don't even remember who it was, and they basically said, what is it that God has never stopped calling you to do? And then they basically said, why aren't you doing it? And then they said something else, bloom where you're planted. Of course, that made me about vomit. You know, it's like, really? And I'm driving into work, and it's like God speaks to me just like this, and it's basically like he's saying, what's in your hand, right? What do you have? Well, you called me to pastor, but I don't have a stage, okay? You called me to pastor, but I don't have a church. And he's like, okay, but when did I stop calling you to pastor? Pastor, where you are. Huh? I work in a carpet store. Yeah. And you have an employee that works directly for you, right? Is he a Christian? No, he couldn't be any further from being a Christian. He wasn't my same race. He wasn't my same ethnicity. He didn't grow up the same way I did. He was younger than me. He'd seen a whole different side of life than me. And God said, you think maybe I put you there for a reason? How about you be a pastor? Oh, I see. You can't be a pastor without a stage. Is that what it is? What's in your hand? I remember I started to do that with this guy, and he showed me more about what it means to be unchurched and the mindset and how he grew up and different things. And he opened my mind, and he was a very amazing guy that I got to know. But can I tell you something? He received Christ as his Savior. You know what? That was the first time in 5 years that I've ever led anybody to the Lord. Pastor John. You think it's a title? I'll tell you what God's saying. He can use you where you are with what you have. But if you don't get it, you're never going to be used, because you're going to think, oh, God can't use somebody. See, I had all the excuses, right? God can't use somebody whose wife is sick. I can't. Right? You can't use somebody, my wife has post-traumatic stress. You can't use somebody that's wife has post-traumatic stress. Can you? You can't use somebody that's wife tried to kill herself. Can you? You can't do that when I don't have my own home anymore. You can use somebody that lives with somebody else and doesn't have enough money and is bitter and angry and all these kinds of things and has probably some rage issues. Could you use somebody like that? Right? Let me ask you, what excuses do you have for not doing what God's calling you to do? Huh? You sick? You mean God can't use somebody that's sick? I'm not trying to be mean. I'm just saying. Let me make it crystal clear. Can God use somebody that's having chemotherapy? Can God use somebody that's struggling in life? Can God use somebody that doesn't have enough money? Can God use somebody... Can God use somebody that's guilty? That's where some of you guys are, and you're missing it. Because you think, I'm going to get all cleaned up and then I'll serve God. And it doesn't work that way, because I believe that just like what happened with Jesus when he's feeding the 5,000, here's what's going to happen. I'm not saying that with purity comes power, but here's how it works. Start giving God what you have, and you know what you're going to find? You're going to find he's already forgiven you, and he's going to use your life again, because somebody lied to you and they told you that if you're divorced, you can't be used by God. If you've had immorality in your life that we can't even speak of in this church, God can't use you. Do you know what the Christian faith is? It's people that are forgiven by a Savior who died on the cross. We're not a little bit bad, okay? So stop believing that lie. God can use you. And God is using people here to do some incredible things that are trying and striving to get closer to God. And believe me when I tell you, I truly believe that God can use your life, and I believe He wants you to get better and stop doing those principles that don't work. But here's what I'm telling you, start where you are. You'd be amazed at how God can make up the difference. It's the only people He can use. You do nothing, and you know what happens? Just like in Matthew 25, where He talks about, hey, there's somebody that buries their talents. You know what He says about that? He goes, they bury the money that the person gave them, and He goes, you wicked, lazy servant. You've been trying to protect it so long. Stop protecting it. God's not afraid. Use it. Use what you have, right? And know that God will make up the difference. I'm telling you, it's the only way it works. I got one more part of the story that I want to tell you today. And I don't talk about this part much, but it has to do with this church, really. I was raised in a pastor's home. It's one of the reasons why I never thought I would be a pastor. Okay? I didn't have a bad childhood. In fact, I grew up in the church that's right down the street, and I got saved there. It was an incredible church. I still have people that I love to death that came from that church. Some of them actually come here, and it was an awesome experience. I didn't have a bad childhood or anything like that. I got to be careful. My mom's here, so I have to say that in the service. You want the real truth? Go back and listen to first service. No, I'm kidding. But I said that first service too. I did not have a bad childhood. And I had a dad that was an incredible man and a great pastor and all that kind of stuff. But living in a pastor's home, you learn you don't want to be a pastor, okay? Anyway. My dad, my senior year in high school, he got cancer. And about 4 years after I graduated, he died. But it was the process after that was interesting to me. That he was close to retirement, and his dream was, hey, when I retire, I'm going to plant a church after this. And probably his church didn't even know that, but it was like, hey, I'm going to get this church straight, and then I'm going to do what God's called me to do, which is to plant a church. He tried that when he was a young adult with my mom and my brother was first born, and they were like in their early 20s. It didn't work out. The church failed. And there's something about that in his journey that was like, it was so devastating he didn't pastor again for a long time. It was very hurtful to him. And then he pastored out here, and it healed him up, and he used his gifts, and it was absolutely awesome. And then he got cancer. And I just remember watching him. And one of the things that happened to him was when I graduated, I wanted to go to Bible college, and he was going to pay for that, but he didn't have enough money, and it crushed him. And I just remember being not upset that I didn't get to go to college. Like, it wasn't a big deal to me. But it was to him. And I just remember looking at him, and it was just like, really? I mean, like, do you still, don't you feel like God's let you down? And I just remember watching in the last days of his life, a man cling to his faith that goes, son, I may have let God down, but He has never let me down. That's what he said. And then he died. And I really didn't understand it. But I want to tell you the rest of this story because it might make a difference here for somebody that doesn't understand where they're at, because honestly, that story didn't make sense 23 years ago when he died. Did I tell you 23 years? Because then after he died, I started going to a church in Chesapeake called Western Branch Community. Did I tell you that story earlier? I just left this part out. Because I thought, hey, if he had faith, maybe it's something I need to look at. And I went to a church that was nothing like what he would do, believe me. And I went there, and I started to learn what church could be like. And I received a call in ministry, not because of my dad. Please don't think that, because he, even on his deathbed, he's like, don't feel called because I called you, John. That's not how it works. And I was pretty far from God right now. He didn't know it. And I went to Western Branch, and I saw it, and God birthed a vision for a church. And then I told you it took 10 years, right? And then we planted a church, 9 years, 10 years. After 10 years, we planted a church. You're sitting in it. And 9 years later, we're here. I would say we're firmly planted, right? I mean, we're not biggest, but we're still here, which is unbelievable for church plants. That's the church that he saw. Because God used what was in his hand. If I hadn't seen a man that clung to his faith, I don't know that I would have it. See, he had faith when I didn't. I didn't have faith in God right then. This doesn't even make sense. But I saw a person that never gave up on God, and then God took me through a process too. And it's not about me, and it's not even about my dad. It's about the power of God and how he could use something. And here's what I want to tell you. You might be thinking, God can't use a deathbed. How do you plant a church from somebody that died? Oh, you're limiting God, are you? Can I ask it again? What do you have in your hand? That's what God's going to use. And when you embrace it, let me tell you something. God's going to do for you like he did with Moses. God's going to do for you like he did with David. God's going to do for you like he did with Elijah. God's going to do for you like he did with Elisha. He's going to do for you like he did with Jesus. Okay, I'm done. Except for one thing. I'll give you one tangible thing. I don't pretend to know what God's saying to you today. But I need to ask, what do you have in your hand? For those of you online, you don't know what I'm doing. I realized first service we were not going to share that because this would not make any sense to them. At the very beginning, we said, who could you invite? And not mass marketing, but if your life has been affected by God, who could you bring along? And you know why I don't think we do? Because some of us say, I'm too sick. I can't help anybody. I'm too poor. I can't help anybody. I'm too guilty. I can't invite anybody. And what you hold in your hand is the power of God. That's a fact. You get it? And some of us aren't going to do it not because we don't believe in this church. We're not going to invite because we don't believe that God could possibly do anything with this. And I will tell you this, that I've had these sit on my stand from people from community church that invited me to things that stayed with me, and they never got to know that. They never even saw me at community church, yet it changed my life. And I'm going to tell you here, I've mailed out some of these cards to people that told me at the last moment of their life when they were thinking about ending it all, they said, hey, you know what was sitting on my stand? A card that you sent me. The invite that you handed me. I didn't think anybody else cared. You know what? When I thought about ending it all, I didn't think anybody else cared about me in this world. Believe me when I tell you, Satan would like nothing better than to say, disrespect what God has put in your hand. It's your life. You're not too sick. You're not too old. You're not too guilty. God can use what you have. When we realize it's God's power, but he uses what we have in our hand. Does that make sense? Okay, I'm going to get out of the way. Let me pray for you guys today. Let's stand for prayer.